Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Schüring. I am a research fellow here at the Rachel Carson Center, and I have been asked to talk about my new project, and it is a pleasure to comply with this request. The title of this project is The Runway, an object-oriented protest history of the Frankfurt Airport extension 1962 until 1987. I'm dealing here with the history of the most contested single infrastructure project of the old Federal Republic. This project made headlines constantly in the 1980s. The protest against it was becoming more and more violent and vehement, and it actually helped mobilize a movement way beyond local concerns. It became a national issue, and it helped bring the Greens as a political party to the stage and turned them into a major political player, first in the state of Hesse and then in the entire Republic. And here's my simple question. Why is it this project that had so many interesting historical consequences? Why is it this project that generated an entire movement? Wasn't it just, if you look closely at it, a NIMBY concern, that is a not in my backyard concern of those who lived near it? And of course the question then would be, who was actually affected by the construction of yet another runway in an environment that was already heavily populated and industrialized for an airport which was already the largest in Germany? And there are several answers to this. First, of course, you have to look at the historical context at the time in which this happened. We are looking at the 1980s here. We are looking at a rather gloomy decade of protest culture in the last throes of the Cold War, which was particularly icy. Back then there was an anti-nuclear movement which was making a lot of headlines. There was a peace movement, and there was quite a mobilization of discontent among the population in the Federal Republic of Germany. So the construction of this runway, which was seen as a symbol for technocracy and was considered an undemocratic attempt to enlarge the already big airport. It was a symbol of a technocratic regime which lacked democratic legitimacy, as the protesters claimed. And here we are. This is how it looks today. This is 3 miles of a runway that has been constructed, and the construction was finished in 1984. And I have another idea here. The second reason for the issue becoming so large has something to do with the fact that I call it an object-centered historical approach. I am, or I have been so far, a historian of science and technology, and I have to admit I like gadgets, I like material beings, and I like to use them and value them as a historical source. You can read these objects, and I think that you will find that every technological object has a cultural meaning, has a cultural and ideological meaning, if you will. And I believe environmental historians are well advised to pay attention to that. That meaning accounts, I believe, and this is my major thesis here, for the tenacious obduracy of projects like this and their proponents. I would go so far in this case as to say that concrete and symbolic cultural meanings of these objects do overlap. As environmental historians and historians of technologies, we should be concerned with the material cultures we both look at the nature of things, at the characteristics of things, of their momentum, of the thing they develop as if they own some sort of agency. I believe we can look at this from a more general point of view if we take into account the common feature of modern technology nowadays as they invade otherwise untouched spaces, also like the tracks that were used to colonize untouched spaces. And we can see that most technological objects that were protested against in the 20th centuries have in one way or another penetrated our environment, and I would thus call them invasive technologies. And we can look at these things in terms of the Habermas term of the colonization of our lived-in world, Kolonialisierung unserer Lebenswelt. And these invasive technologies, of course, are ambivalent. They can be both benign and destructive. Consider the space of our body. We have gadgets that are actually connected. We have the bullet, we have the syringe, and we have the scalpel. And all these technologies, of course, are somewhat connected by one narrative. And when we take this, so to speak, as the construction of a cultural meaning, we can go further and see how the modern technologies of aero mobility, just as this runway, are invading our spaces. And here in this picture we see how the construction site is being protected by a concrete wall, on the other side of which protesters gather, all of them with raincoats, not because of the bad weather, of course, but because there are water cannons on the other side of that fence. The building site does penetrate the environment, and so we see stages here that form where protest is being organized. The symbolism is, so to speak, cultural, symbolic, and concrete. Concrete in the sense that concrete is being used as a construction material, and that, of course, has been defining the industrial landscape of Central Europe for quite a while. And concrete itself is, in a way, the most hated material of environmentalists back then. Look at what has become of the cities, is what they claim, the polemical popular trope being the concrete desert, the Betonwüste. You know, that is the thing people complain about when they look at the changes in their environment. And we have slogans like this here, pinned to the concrete structures, schade, dass Beton nicht brennt, which means it's a pity that concrete doesn't burn. So, and when we look at the invasive technology that is a runway, we can see how these concrete slabs cuts into the environment, cuts into this forest, almost like a blade, almost like the scalpel I've been showing you before. So, and the forest we can see in the background, and parts of the forest, of course, had to be removed for the construction of this kind of space. So, and what kind of space is this that we're looking at? When we're looking at airports, they are quite fascinating in the sense that they are indeed always both, you know, a traffic infrastructure and an urban environment. And it has been noted before that the remarkable thing about this is that airports have become to look and function like cities, whereas our cities indeed have started to look like airports. Airports are also, in a way, highly protected spaces. You can see the barbed wire around the Frankfurt airport and its runways. Here, protected spaces that symbolize how much the airport actually means as a gateway to certain polities and countries. Airports are, of course, the things that people see first when they come to a country, and that's also the space where people are detained first when one country doesn't want them to enter. So airports are also detention centers for asylum seekers, waiting rooms for the unfortunate who actually are not allowed to move across the globe as they please. So in that sense, the airport is a space that defines the privilege of access. It's a highly regulated place. You can also see an airport as a symbol for global inequality, and thus a rather imperial place, right? Its invasive nature culturally connects and corresponds with its imperial gesture. And the space, of course, I mean, the thing that actually concerned the adversaries of the airport extension the most was the appropriation of space through noise pollution, as we can actually see in this map. This is a noise pollution map of Frankfurt Airport. The blue lines you see are the locations of the runways itself, and the runway that has been contested, the runway 18 West, is the blue spike you see pointing downwards on this image. And this is interesting to see when you look at the historical dynamics of this protest movement. This is how it got started. The first concern that people actually were bringing forth and complained about was noise pollution. All the other ecological concerns, concerns about the groundwater, concerns about biodiversity, really only followed. And this is interesting if you want proof for the fact that this was a NIMBY concern. It's actually the rhetorical strategy adopted by the protesters at the beginning of their protest movement in the 1970s, that they actually said to the authorities, okay, noise is a big problem, we can't sleep, we really need some calm here in our region. Why don't you direct the traffic elsewhere to airports that are not as congested as Frankfurt? Why don't you direct traffic of international airlines to other airports in Germany, which can also be used as hubs like Hanover or something. So it's not so much about the reduction of air traffic as such in this argument, but the fact that people don't want this phenomenon in their neighborhood. And I would think that these rhetorical strategies have then undergone quite a number of changes, and later on it was more about the protection of the forest and of the natural environment of the runway. So in that sense, of course, the forest too became a space of occupation and invasion, as people who wanted to protect the forest around the airport actually went in and built a little protest site, a little village of huts, makeshift huts and tree houses in which they would actually reside, which became an interesting and important cultural symbol for protesters. Such because people also organized cultural events and readings and concerts there. So people actually came from further away to go there and express their solidarity with the community there. And what's also interesting for the culture of protest at this point is that the communal spirit that developed in this village here actually transcended both generational and ideological boundaries. People would gather, young and old, conservative and progressive. It was called back then the concerted protest of the long-haired and the gray-haired, right? Protest der Langhaarigen and Grauhaarigen. So this mobilization, of course, was considered a provocation for the authorities, and we have to look at who is actually behind the proponents of the airport. It's not just the airport company itself, Fraport, but it's also the state of Hesse and the Federal Republic who hold shares in the Fraport company. So you have an alliance here of various actors who are in favor of the airport, and these actors, of course, have at their disposal police forces, which would then later come in and remove the people here from the forest. And this is, of course, where unfortunately the whole thing got violent. So we can see once legal procedures, legal protests and lawsuit failed to stop the project, that the protest became a little more violent, and that people who lived in the forest at that point were violently removed by police forces, including the border police, which was interesting because that's the only federal police Germany at that time actually knew. So the tragic endpoint of this violent protest movement came in November 1987, which is interesting because that was 3 years after the runway was already completed and operational in 1987. Protest marches next to the runway still took place, and in one of these protest marches, actually 2 policemen were shot, which led to the very abrupt end of the protest movement surrounding the airport. A very devastating and tragic event where most of the peaceful protesters actually said, we didn't want this to go in this direction. And of course, that could be also addressed as one of the reasons why the protest failed. Again, after all, the runway was constructed, it's still operational, and we can look at, and this is the point I want to make, at all the actors that acted in favor of the project, and to see the power of the idea behind this runway is, of course, the power represented by a globalized city like Frankfurt. Frankfurt at this point already was a financial center in Central Europe, and Frankfurt, of course, the city of Frankfurt officially argued in favor of the airport, which is, of course, their gateway to the world. We have to take into consideration that 25% of all inhabitants of Frankfurt don't have a German passport. And of course, they are in need of a global gateway to where they want to travel as well. So, when you look at all of this, of course, you can ask yourself, okay, what was at stake? What was at stake for the protesters, and what was at stake for the players behind the project? So, Frankfurt Airport follows what we all know to be the so-called hub and spoke concept of aero mobility. That means you would take smaller airplanes from wherever you would travel in to go to Frankfurt and then actually change into a bigger airplane which would take you intercontinentally to destinations further away from Germany. Hub and spoke. There are several of these kinds of airports in the world that most of us probably have already seen. Heathrow, Atlanta is infamous for that kind of concept. So these airports are not only serving the region for people who wanted to visit Germany and go there, but it's also serving a global community of air travelers. And I bet that most of you have probably already been on Startbahn West, on the runway 18 West that was so contested, because most of you who fly intercontinentally probably went through Frankfurt once or several times in their lives. So the hub and spoke concept, of course, is a very powerful argument for the proponents of the airport. And I have mentioned it before, the technological sphere that we are looking here at, that Frankfurt is connected to, is the sphere of aero mobility. The airport, of course, as a system of runways, doesn't make sense without runways elsewhere in the world. It is connected in what scholars today call a technosphere of aero mobility. That is, Frankfurt is connected to other hubs worldwide, and you could call this a socio-technological system that includes all the other airports. And that, of course, is also a reason why international organizations of airlines and airports lobbied heavily the state of Hesse, the city of Frankfurt, politicians and activists, to make a construction possible. IATA actually also became active, and to no one's surprise, the alpha male here in this economical regions, the Lufthansa company, which of course also argued for the expansion of the airport, said we need this runway, the airport is congested, we need more space, we need more flights to actually follow the demand of our customers. And this is, of course, also where statistics come into play. You can see here in this various graphs the increase of air traffic at Frankfurt Airport, and people back then, when they were arguing for the expansion, said that in the 1990s and later we will probably look at about 30 million passengers a year going through Frankfurt. And one has to say that all these projections, all these prognoses of the growth of air traffic at Frankfurt have been vindicated so far, to the point that nowadays, if you talk to people, they are looking forward at welcoming about 80 million passengers at Frankfurt Main Airport a year soon. So in the history of infrastructures, this is an interesting issue, a contested issue among historians, that is whether these projects actually follow demand in congested places or whether they are designed to create demand and create growth. Both is obviously the case. When you say our airport is congested, we need more space for the airplanes to take off, then you are arguing that demand is there and has to be met. Otherwise, airlines and people will just take their business elsewhere to the detriment of the region. The other thing is, of course, they also propose growth. That is, they argue in favor of the rise of employment numbers and people who have been working for the airport and in connection with the airport in the 1980s already numbered about 50,000. So that's a strong argument that also the trade unions use to argue in favor of the airport. So we have a collection here of major players who work together and who form an alliance which is hard to fight against if you want to protect the environment of, as I said, a highly congested, populated, industrialized region. Because my question again is, what is actually at stake when we protest against such an infrastructure project? And cynics, of course, have already pointed out, okay, we are talking about a few acres of forest in an already highly populated and industrialized region. And that's, of course, not an argument that goes against the urgency and concern of the people surrounding it, because that few acres of forest, of course, was valued by the inhabitants of the regions as one of the few remnants of recreational space, as a playground for children, as a place where you could actually hike. So it's not just concrete, it's of course also symbolic. Why do we have to destroy this? You have to look at the forest, of course, not so much as a pristine environment here that's being destroyed. We're not talking about Yosemite or Yellowstone here, but we're talking about something that can be regarded rather as a garden or a park. So just imagine you would tell New Yorkers you would take away Central Park from them, and the argument, okay, but this city is already big and there's concrete everywhere, so what's the point? Well, the point is that you have that green spot that you can go to and retreat to, and people actually resented the fact that the proponents of the airport didn't actually care for this little part of nature as much. So when we compare this to other environmental projects, we can of course see that the airport back then was not so much a symbol for dangerous technology, just like nuclear technology at this point. There was no radiation, no major accident that could endanger thousands and hundred thousands of people in the regions. But the symbolic value of the runway should not be underestimated, and the value, the economic value and the value as a socio-technological system should not be underestimated as well. And this is the reason why the airport still kept expanding. Here on this image you can see on the right side another runway that was constructed, and the construction was finished in 2011, runway northwest, and there was protest against that as well, but not nearly as vehement, not nearly gripping the public imagination as Startbahn West, which is the thing that you can see here pointing to the left. So Landebahn Nordwest has been finished, but it has not generated headlines as much as Startbahn West, which also has something to do with that, with the fact that the way these conflicts were conducted, the way discussions were led, has changed since the 1980s. New forms of mediation and discussion culture have actually developed. The airport is a little more compromising when it comes to compensation, of course, for people who saw their property values diminished, and the airport, of course, also promised to replant trees in other regions of the state of Hesse. So all of this has become a little more civil, and that's my interpretation here. This is why the construction of the other runway has been conducted so much more quietly. And but I want to point out at this point, and this is how I summarize, the fact that the technosphere of air mobility actually recruits so many major players that argue in favor of these projects. I mean, the airlines, the surrounding industry, the local politicians, that environmentalists have a very hard time arguing against it. There's so much of dynamic and actually agency behind these projects that I believe failure was the predictable outcome of this. I think this sums up what I want to say to you. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.